I welcome everyone. Lots of folks are joining, so we'll give it a few minutes here. Thanks for joining already for those who are on. All right, well, let's get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We will be recording this session and sharing that link out after with everyone. Excited to have so many folks joining us from all over the country, all different sectors, for global burning, national media coverage of climate change and wildfires in Canada. Over the next 75 minutes, we're going to dive into and discuss how the Canadian national media has been covering climate change and wildfires, and ideas on how communicators can improve the coverage. My name is Kara Pike. I'm the Senior Advisor at Re.Climate. I'm joining you today from the lands of Cowichan First Nation, where I live. And I welcome all of you to, as we're waiting for others to join in the chat, introduce yourself, your affiliation, and where you're joining us from. It's always fun to see the diversity of participants. So looking forward to all of you doing that and seeing who's with us today. We had more than 400 people registered for the webinar, so we're really excited. Includes government, NGOs, researchers. We also have some funders on, including the McConnell Foundation. Without them, this work would not be possible. We also have Ivy Foundation and Trache, Clean Economy Fund, Energy Transition Fund. Thank you so much for your support of Re.Climate. Again, for those just joining us now, I welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat, your affiliation, and where you're joining us from. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then quickly go over the agenda, and then we'll start with the presentations. So we're very excited to have Chris Hatch join us, communications consultant. He works with Re.Climate as a researcher, and is focused his work currently on energy and climate change. He's the former executive editor for Canada's National Observer, where he writes the weekly newsletter Zero Carbon. Chris was previously executive director of Rainforest Action Network and has a background in campaigns and strategic communications on clean energy, climate change, human rights, and general environmental sanity. We also have Gada Alashid, who is the resource and training lead with us at Re.Climate. Gada supports research, knowledge mobilization, and the development of resources, evidence-based tools, and training program for Re.Climate's network of 750 organizations and more than 2,000 climate influencers. With a PhD in communication and a wealth of experience spanning the academic, federal, and NGO sectors, she brings a unique understanding of effective research and knowledge mobilization practices in climate communications. We also are lucky to have Trish Audette Longo with us today, who's assistant professor at Carleton University. Trish is an assistant professor in the School of Journalism and Communication and co-director of the Climate Disaster Project. She holds a PhD in communication studies from Concordia University and has covered the environment, politics, and crime beats for the Edmonton Journal and managed digital engagement for the National Observer. Her research includes digital journalism and journalism education, climate change, and petrocultural studies. We also have Chris Russell with us, who is our academic director at Re.Climate and an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Communication. His current work focuses on problems of disinformation and denial in their relevance to climate action. Chris is editor of Critical Approaches to Climate Change and Civic Action with Annabella Carvillo and Julie DeLea collection, exploring conceptual invention in public forms of climate action. And we're also lucky to have Maria Granados back with us today, who supported us with this research project and the webinar. So just so everyone has a sense of how the flow is going to go, we'll take about 45 minutes for presentations. We'll first hear from Chris and then Gada sharing out the findings from the national media analysis. And then we will have Chris share some information about the Climate Disaster Project and her perspectives as a journalist. And then Chris will dive into misinformation around wildfires and some of those trends. And then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. Thank you for those who sent questions in advance. We'll try and get to those, as many of those as possible. And the way we're going to manage things is for any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A, and we can either direct them directly to speakers, or if you just have a general question, Maria and I will be tracking those and responding to them throughout the webinar. If you want to be sharing any resources with one another or ideas, feel free to do that in the chat. And just again, one more reminder for those who just joined us, we'd love to hear from you in the chat, your name, affiliation, and where you're joining us from. So again, thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Hatch.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm in Vancouver, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam territories. The report that we're going to look at today, I'm going to quickly zip over some of the key highlights, is looking at the big national media outlets, Globe, CTV, CBC, National Post, Financial Post, those kinds of large national outlets. And we looked at a couple of different timeframes so that we could capture how they're covering wildfires, how they're covering climate change in general, exclusive of wildfires. So you'll see different timeframes as we skip through. But just to be clear, we're looking at the big national outlets here. So you're not going to get a dive into how regional media were covering wildfires or climate change. We're not getting how the issues are being covered in Quebec in French. And we're not getting the narratives on social media. This is the big national coverage. And here's what we found. We have seen an increase in coverage in the last couple of years. It's not enormous, and as you'll see, it actually dipped last year. I don't think you could say it has kept up with the escalation in climate impacts, but there has been an uptick. And we found broad acceptance of the climate science and the need for action. The sort of two-siding of climate change, the overt questioning of the need for action is really quite rare in the national media now, with some notable exceptions, which is notably the analysis and opinion pages of the National Post and Financial Post. But what we also found is that there is really not much context. If you are a casual or average news consumer, you would know that this year was an extraordinary wildfire year in Canada. You probably would not know that it was the same in many other parts of the world. You certainly would not know that all kinds of climate metrics like global temperatures, sea surface temperatures, Antarctic ice are really off the charts, even compared to the last few years. You would not know, for example, that scientists are trying to figure out what the hell is going on this year, that it's been just an absolutely crazy 2023, really abnormal, really anomalous. But that is not often covered. And if you're an average consumer, you probably have almost no idea that that's the situation that we're in. So let's go to the amount of coverage. As I say, it has ticked up. It's about 17% higher in 2023 than it was 2 years ago after a dip last year. And we're going to come back to this chart with some other indicators as well in a little bit. But let's move to the next for now. You can see here where climate figures as an issue in terms of the prioritization it's getting in the media. You might be surprised at how high COVID still is. Climate is well back of the economy and the inflation, probably not a huge surprise. Also well back of healthcare, in and around mental health and immigration as the level of priority that the national media are giving it. And on. When the media turns to covering climate action, as opposed to the issue itself, but what are we going to do about it? What we find mainly is that the solutions overwhelmingly focus on renewable energy and electric vehicles. So these are really the most sort of depoliticized and green consumery kinds of topics that get the most coverage. And we find that there's a lot of talk about reducing emissions. Can we just go back just for a sec? But there's very little unpacking of what reducing emissions means. So people that are getting their information from the national news probably don't understand that we need to get to zero for global warming to stop getting worse. And also this sort of abstract phrase around reducing emissions really doesn't identify for the public the actual cause. So, while climate change is not disputed anymore in the media by and large, it's sort of in this weird limbo where what's causing climate change is rarely actually named. So it's pretty rare, we found, that fossil fuels or the specific fossil fuels like oil and gas and coal are actually highlighted. If you're anything like me, the algorithms are feeding you stories that do contextualize climate change. You are hearing that there are these crazy events simultaneously around the world, that there are all these wild anomalies in terms of temperature and ice cover and that kind of thing. And you are hearing that we need to transition off fossil fuels. But if you're the average news consumer, you're probably not hearing those things very often at all. So on the next slide, what we see is a version of that one I started with, where we see on the top line that climate change has ticked up in coverage, definitely since last year, but even since the year before. It's 17% increase over 2 years. Coverage of renewable energy also ticked up after a low point last year, but hasn't even recovered to the level of 2021. And then where it comes to fossil fuels, or specific fossil fuels being named, like oil and gas and coal, much lower again. And in fact, the amount of coverage that makes the connection explicit has actually decreased somewhat from 2021. So when we move to the next highlight from the report, we're looking here at the kinds of solutions that are covered in the national media. And solutions, I recognize, is kind of a strange term. The big question is whether climate change is a solvable thing, but let's just go with it for the time being. We need some kind of shorthand. And what you see is that when the media turns its attention to what should be done, it's overwhelmingly about renewable energy and about electric vehicles. So those are the two sort of symbolic shorthands that the media has been adopting when it covers climate action. A couple of other interesting points here. You'll notice that hydrogen is getting an enormous amount of attention in the national press. It gets attention almost exclusively as a potential solution. It is almost never covered as a problem. As many of you on the webinar will probably know, we make a lot of hydrogen already for refineries and that kind of thing. And it is in itself, as it stands, a large GHG emitter. So it's actually a problem that needs to be solved. But it is in the press covered as a solution to climate change. Net zero, actually pretty high. Not anywhere near renewable energy and electric vehicles. But as I mentioned earlier, it's very rarely unpacked so that people don't understand just from the news media that it's not about reducing emissions, it's about actually eliminating emissions. And you can see for yourself down the chart, and you'll see it when you get the report, sort of practical steps that consumers could take that aren't about electric vehicles are actually quite low. They're not covered very much at all. That would be different, I think, this week. If we were doing a media analysis of what the national media is covering this week, heat pumps are obviously a really big thing. But in general, the media sticks to renewable energy and electric vehicles. Now, if we move to the next set of findings, when we pull out the most dominant narratives around taking action on climate change, what we find is that probably the most common narrative, so here we're talking about the kind of frames and narratives that underlie the coverage, it is a sense of both and. So that we are going to be using oil and gas for years to come, and at the same time, we're going to boost renewables. So there's little clarity for the public coming out of the national news on the actual pathway that we need to build all this renewables and other clean energy in order to switch off fossil fuels. That sort of step of fuel switching, electrifying everything and running on clean electricity is pretty rarely made explicit. Now, when we turn to the next set of findings, we look at wildfires, and especially this summer. What we found, and this was actually a bit surprising, is there is almost no misinformation in the national media about wildfires. There is a ton of narrative out there, and Chris Russell, I know, is going to get into this more, about arson being the main cause and that kind of thing. That's not, in our findings, a result of the national media. In fact, when the national media covers those kinds of issues, it's almost always myth busting. So they're trying to debunk the misinformation. And they also generally broadly accept climate change as a driver of wildfires, and especially the extreme series of wildfires that we had this summer. So they accept it, by which I mean they're not disputing it or both sidesing it. But the wildfires from this summer were rarely linked to extreme events around the world. Again, if your news algorithm is anything like mine, you were seeing a lot of coverage about how there's all these simultaneous floods and fires and heat waves and all of that. The average consumer is not getting very much of that at all. And although the national media generally accepts the connection between wildfires and climate change, it's not usually explicit. So what we found is that only 16% of stories about wildfires mention climate change. And it's important to note that we've already culled a lot of the wildfire stories. So the wildfire stories that you would not really expect to talk about climate change are not in this 16% to start. So, if it's about evacuation alerts or sort of urgent stories, if it's about weather, if it's about, a wildfire bearing down on a particular town, those kind of stories we excluded from this bit of the analysis. We're just looking at stories about the wildfires more broadly, and only 16% of them mention climate change. So it is worth noting that the public is making this connection. It's worth noting that for you as communicators, because you're operating in a context where, even though the media isn't making the climate connection explicitly very often, the public has caught on. 3/4 of Canadians think the wildfires this summer are worse because of climate change, and 2/3 of them think extreme events are going to keep getting worse. So if we look at how it plays out over time, the next slide shows you a chart. Last year compared to this year. So last year was a very low wildfire year in Canada, and this year very high. And so you can see exactly what you'd expect in terms of wildfire stories. And you can also see that there's some correlation to climate change, so that there's more coverage of climate change as there's more coverage of wildfires, but not nearly a one-to-one comparison. And you've got to consider also that there were so many climate change impact stories, especially this summer, other than the Canadian wildfires. Even if they're not contextualized, there were lots and lots of individual isolated stories. So that boosts the coverage as well. And the reason there's not a really direct correlation, you'll see on the next slide, which is that of all the wildfire stories we pulled after netting out the evacuation alerts and that kind of thing, over 5,000 of them over the course of the summer, only 883 made the explicit connection to climate change, so 16.5%. And it's interesting that other kinds of climate impacts are actually linked more tightly. So extreme heat, for example, as you might expect, is such an obvious linkage to climate change, and over a third in that case are directly linked. Floods, though, which are not as sort of intuitive, are still almost twice as likely to be linked to climate change as are wildfires. So for flooding, extreme flooding, we find that about 30% of the coverage makes the link to climate change. And now I'm going to hand things over to Getta to take you deeper into the wildfire narratives.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. So, well, Chris provided an overview of climate change and wildfire stories, a high-level overview. But we took a sample to dig deeper in themes and frames and voices that appeared in these stories, and specifically in wildfire stories. And we had a few expectations. Some of them were right, but we had surprises as well. And I will share some of these with you. One is that, as you see in this chart, the focus of the wildfire coverage revolved around human impacts, such as the extent of the damage that happened, the firefighting efforts, evacuations, and more than any other frame. And this is different. The focus on the human impact is different from the broader narratives in climate change, which usually center on the frames of policy or economics or politics. And that trend of around climate change and how that how that coverage of climate change dismissed the human impact is something that we observed through our research since Re.Climate started the research on media narrative. But and there were also many stories that were shared in and in these news articles. Again, different from the coverage of climate change, which did not pay attention to human stories. Stories of evacuees, homeowners, and local residents. And these were covered in national media. And this is something that we have to say that national media did well, of getting the human impact and getting the stories of people. The second most common frame was the climate adaptation frame, which included discussions of measures taken to address the effects of wildfires. And these measures ranged from wearing masks or using air purifiers to bigger ones, like implementing better forest management strategies or better land use policies, or more about the Fire Smart program. However, we observed the discussion of these adaptation measures focus on those that were immediate, were urgent, like the air purifier, and less on longer term strategies, such as sustainable forest management. But I have to mention also that we looked at national media and not regional media. Probably conversations in regional media were richer, especially in regions where they had fires in last years, like BC and Alberta, where that conversation is not new as here in Ontario, where I'm located. And also one thing that we were curious about, whether is there a doom and gloom frame, this apocalyptic frame, was it there in media? Did it dominate the coverage? And there was a sense of despair, but was not as dominant. But there were really stories that got a lot of attention, which adopted that frame. And I'm sure that many of you have read McLean's story, and we can move to the next slide to show the story. So the McLean story about how Canada would look like in 2060. It was apocalyptic, talking about how the summers would look like, how Canadians would miss the Canada that we have now. Political extremism was the result. So a really gloomy picture without much space in that story for what's next and for hope that we can have. Also, a bit of a surprise that we had while doing this was the health impacts and the health frame was not as much addressed as we had expected. We were expecting this to be a top frame, but it wasn't that. And we can go to the previous slide to show this. Doctors also are not the main voices in these health stories. And we know from the public opinion roll-up that we do here at Re.Climate that doctors are one of the top trusted people when it comes to communicating about climate change. However, this was not apparent in the wildfire coverage. So we know from that doctors' voices were missing in the coverage of the wildfire. Also, discussions related to policies and actions for climate mitigation were infrequent in the national media coverage. When it comes to voices and who are most quoted or referenced, politicians unfortunately appear as the most quoted people in the coverage. And this is also what we have observed in the coverage of climate change. The Prime Minister, premiers are quoted a lot, and notably Danielle Smith was also highly referenced in this coverage. And after this group, there were wildfire and emergency officials, and then academics were cited. And then the affected people, who were usually homeowners and evacuees and some local residents. certain groups, despite being disproportionately impacted, were notably underrepresented in the media narratives. Vulnerable population and Indigenous communities, these voices were not adequately highlighted in the coverage that we took a look at. We also, if we go to the next slide, we also know from the research that we did that Indigenous communities well, actually, we know from the research that Indigenous communities are roughly 5% of Canada's population, but they make up to 40% of wildfire evacuations here in Canada. And as you see in the pie chart, 16% of wildfire stories mention First Nation or Indigenous people at all. And in the sample that we looked at, it's just 10% of these selected stories were had an Indigenous or social justice framing. Moving to the next one about regional attention, and Quebec had the largest burned area in 2023, and the Northwest Territories suffered the second largest area burned. But as you see in comparing the 5 regions, they come in last. So the Northwestern Territories were just constituted or were referenced in 13% of stories on wildfire in Canadian national media. So these are some of the the highlights and some of the gaps, and we hope that with that report that we can draw attention to these gaps, and so it's an opportunity for both climate communicators and journalists to address these gaps. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having Climate Disaster Project here, and thank you to Gada and to Chris for this report and sharing it with us. We could take a look at it ahead of time. I'm Trish Odette-Longo. I'm a co-director of the Climate Disaster Project, and I'm based in Ottawa on the unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. We look at people's stories of living through climate change, and we often talk about these as stories of hope. We work with students across Canada and elsewhere in the world at altogether 17 schools, where we are actually going out and interviewing folks who have experienced climate disasters. But we also start with the idea that the students themselves and everyone who's involved in this project is a survivor of climate disaster in some way. One of the things that we often say is that there's no story of climate change that's too big or too small, and there is a power in uniting people to make change, so that you can learn something from your neighbors and listening carefully and closely to the stories and to the testimonies that they're sharing, and also in sharing your own testimonies, your own experiences, and potentially your own solutions. So one of the things that comes out of this report broadly is the idea of sort of an absence of simultaneity, or the idea that a disaster that's happening in one place might also be occurring in other places at the same rate or at the same time. This came through in that media scan. One of the things that we're looking at is the presence and the co-presence of climate disaster. The idea that people are not alone in their experiences. And our hope as we bring more and more stories together, so to date, since 2021, we've gathered 128 testimonies of climate disaster. We are building up to being able to share all of those all of the time, so that you can start to get a feeling of just the extent to which we are living through disasters together, the extent or the specificity of different kinds of disasters and different kinds of experiences. If you have encountered climate disaster stories, you might have seen them in places like the Taillis or Aspergus or APTN or elsewhere, where some of those stories are being shared now. Our approach to this is trauma-informed. So when I say that, we spend a great deal of time with the storytellers And again, starting in the classroom, students first are interviewed themselves. So they interview each other. They kind of go through the list of questions and they understand the arc that takes place within those questions from, who are you? What's your experience? What did you experience during a specific disaster? What do you remember? Who was there for you? Who were you there for? All the way through to what do you think of as solutions? Through the trauma-informed storytelling process, people who are sharing their stories have a lot of power. They have a lot of power to sort of review the questions, to think about the questions, to think about what they've said, and to ensure that the story that gets out into the world first is the story that they, are living with, that they want to see out there. So I think of this as very much co-led storytelling. And when you might see it in print out in the world, you might see two people's names on it. So the person who's telling the story and the person who, worked with them to collect that story and to see it through in their voice. We pay attention to communities of care, and this is kind of one of the questions that we're starting to build out. So who's helping who? How do people think of the communities in which they live? How do they think of their neighbors as experts? How do they think of themselves as experts in these experiences? And what do they start to offer in terms of what can they see as pathways forward? So some of the narratives that you're seeing in national media coverage in terms of affordability, the cost of inaction, the cost of wildfires, the impacts on health, these are things that we are starting to see too in some of the stories that are coming out. A next step for us, and one that we've started, is doing investigations into these things. And so you'll see stories have already come out about, who receives alerts about emergencies as they are unfolding. What is missing from those alerts? What else can be done to make those alerts better? What is the impact of smoke inhalation if you are a tree planter working all summer in that sector? So what are the effects on you in your life? And broadly, what can we start to take away from those questions about health impacts? Who is evacuated most often? Who is given support as they are being evacuated? And what other kinds of support can we start to imagine for folks who are experiencing a range of climate disasters? So these are kind of bigger questions that we're still working through. We're beginning to investigate them. We're also working through just what are some lingering shared experiences and lingering and shared possibilities for the future. So thank you so much.
Everyone, this is great so far. Thank you to Chris and Gata for that report, and to Trish and Sean and all the participants and survivors that are sharing their stories. I think it's really shaped my thinking in this space. Can we click ahead one slide maybe? Here we go. So many of you will know I work on communication of extreme events and climate change, and I decided this spring and summer, to work with journalists that work on this question, on how the association of extreme events and climate change is communicated and contested. Thought it'd be illuminating. I could learn something. It'd be fun, and just maybe take a couple hours, out of my spring and summer. And of course, we got a little more than we expected. And especially once the fires painted New York City a different color and started sending people to emergency rooms, it became a different kind of story. And so we've covered some of the national story here, but it became an international one. And one of the interesting things is that it already was an international story in many ways. For example, the situation, it was completely unmanageable, right? So we had firefighters and assistance from New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, elsewhere, coming to assist. And then, of course, we had international media taking a larger look at things, more intense look at things. And I think it started to change perhaps some of the ways in which we think about and cover climate change internal to Canada. I think if you squint hard at what Gata and Chris are showing us, you can see the conversation on climate change changing. Perhaps this is because I'm filtering it through some of the local journalism and some of the work Trish has been speaking about. So although I think journalists could do a much better job in covering industry, I think there's some changes around extreme events that are worth flagging. Can we click ahead one slide, Maria? So it used to be that there was only one way of associating extreme events and climate change that was really allowed. And even this was only allowed in some contexts and never really when those events were going on. So you could say a type or kind of event like this example here was made more frequent or more intense as a result of climate change, often in the case of heat-related things, heat waves, maybe heat domes, drought, sometimes sea level rise, flooding. But it was a sign of restraint, of knowingness, of scientific literacy, of not being alarmist, to not go any further than that because you would be ahead of the science. And if you're ahead of the science, you're being alarmist. Many of you might remember during the 2016 Fort McMurray disaster, there were vocal directives published by editors and politicians instructing people not to make these associations. It just wasn't the time to do so. So I think this summer we saw that that time is over. If we click ahead one slide, we'll see that we have the attribution of specific events, sometimes while they're ongoing, to climate change. So not trends or a kind of event, but very specific fires in this case. And this is largely the result of a group called World Weather Association. And they really ramped up around 2017. And we've seen now some of this work starting to find its way into public discussion of wildfire in Canada, which I take to be a really important development that I hope gets amplified and engaged with. In addition, as you'll see on the next slide, you have local journalists taking these attributions of specific events to climate change, not as dogma, but as a springboard, so that you start to see the impacts being localized by local journalists, humanized, connected to previous events in our cultural memory. And these moments and events, they're not just getting connected in their significance, but they're starting to become the context in which some of us think about climate change generally. So you're seeing, I think, an opportunity to not just think about extreme events through the register of apocalypse and anxiety, but you're starting to see questions of vulnerability be put into adaptive and care and aid-based frameworks. So in the next slide, Chris covered this already, but you'll see this is data from an Abacus poll this summer, and we see that people seem to be ahead of the national conversation, at least as on wildfire, and this tracks with some of the stories I've read from Tricia's project and what I hear my students saying when they say that they smelled, they tasted, they choked on climate change. So not an association, but they're drawing on sensory experience to make these connections. And I think this is particularly important. So we've seen that extreme events is sort of an abstraction. I think there's something very specific about fires in this country. And these are the moments when our vulnerability to climate change is being made really visible. It's becoming intensely felt. And when the inequitable distribution of that vulnerability and harm is being made visible and being felt too, to people that don't already have 2 feet into the climate change discussion. Now, of course, this means that we see lots of misinformation, which pools around high-profile events, especially extreme events and discussions of climate solutions, whether those solutions are policy-related or technological in nature. And so this is complicated. I won't be able to do justice to all of it, but just like a few remarks to get us started. First of all, I think journalists did an excellent job in identifying and debunking misinformation. I spoke with a lot of them. I felt all of them were trying to do this well. And I feel like they did it in a way that inhibited rather than contributed to the amplification and engagement with this content, which is really what the misinformation game is about. But they did struggle to explain why this was happening. And I felt often there's a default to the idea that conspiracies are just popular on social media. So kind of the sort of explanation that I like to call the because the internet sort of explanation. So in addition, I think we're unfortunately in a situation where journalism is becoming less and less important culturally, and that's because it's being explicitly undermined by digital platforms as a matter of policy. We can talk a bit about that later, but I felt they did a pretty good job, and I interpret some of what Chris and Gada found in terms of the absence of this misinformation circulating in the national conversation as an indication of that. So the main forum, this is a slide from a group called Climate Action Against Disinformation. I'll share the data monitor they published from which this is extracted, where they were comparing the Australian bushfires in 2018, 2020 US fires, which is captured on this slide, and what was happening this year. Just noting the prevalence of keywords and original tweets associated with arson and eco-terrorism. Now, this is a very common trope or frame, and it's hard to deal with because Human caused is often, if not usually, how fires get started. Human caused, of course, can mean accidental or unintentional, but it's very easy to conflate smoothly the idea of human caused and arson in a way that's frequently drawn upon in some of the social media misinformation we saw. As well as many of you know, when these fires happen, investigations are launched so people can point to ongoing investigations, even though that's simply a matter of procedure. And it's clear to me, and I think the people that published, did this work at CAD, that there's a playbook to really misdirect the conversation from extreme events, wildfire in particular, from climate change to arson, trying to move the conversation out of the moment in which it's happening. One, I think, point to flag here, misinformation, I think, is often, or disinformation in particular, is seen as false claims that need to be argued with or debunked, but it's often just a game of recontextualizing things that may be true or legitimate. And so not contesting fires or what's happening, but trying to move them into a different context around human causes or arson. But most of these arson claims, as we see on the next slide, are not. So this is an example of a politician using the claim to arson to really interrupt or downplay the association. But if we click ahead to the next slide, we see something different from mere deflection, but we see the effort to really link these to a story that mobilizes anti-establishment post-COVID narratives around what I call climate tyranny or climate authoritarianism. So Unacceptable Canadian Girl here is very helpful in kind of just drawing the thread between what's happening. And you can see here that climate change appears to be drawn into what looks like your conventional culture war stuff. But I think it is important to see this in a more historical and localized way as part of the post-COVID narrative that's been created by anti-lockdown, anti-vax, anti-mask, mainly anti-public health crowd, which has taken the pain and suffering and trauma and anxiety, the bad feelings of the pandemic, and pointed them not at the virus, but at public health policy as a mechanism of state overreach and the potential onset of authoritarian government. But as public health policy has failed to materialize that authoritarian government, as it's really put its head down, climate policy has become much more visible. And so you're seeing these networks, these accounts, and these stories fasten on climate policy and climate events to keep those networks together, to keep themselves topical, and to continue with this idea. And so the idea that the government or the Trudeau government started these fires, that Environment and Climate Change Canada is putting together a climate police force, the idea of 15-minute cities, if you've seen some of these conspiracies, they all pool around this similar narrative. So Justin Ling, the investigative reporter, has suggested during the wildfires that there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people engaging with this content online. So I agree with him when he suggests this is a pretty significant problem worth considering. To wind it up, if we click to the next slide, we'll see that these online narratives can have real-world consequences for people trying to manage the fires. So for mayors, emergency management, firefighters, first responders, all of them felt either frustrated or had their capacity to do their work interrupted by the continual calls to address misinformation around what they were doing. And I think this is a next step that would be important into the media coverage of misinformation, not just to debunk false claims or to argue with it, but to think about the ways the online circulation of these narratives degrades the capacity to mobilize a response. So this article is talking about an attempt to enter a fire evacuation zone, which led to the withdrawal of firefighters and first responders during that moment as they were worried about a Truth and Freedom convoy breaching the evacuation zone. This is not the only way. This is perhaps one of the more extreme examples of how these online narratives can generate problems. But I think this is something we need to pay a little bit more attention to. Last point, because I know I'm standing between us and the questions, I brought a slide from Maclean's magazine where they juxtapose a kind of apocalyptic, adaptive sort of sensibility. It's from 2019, not from this year. And I think it's really interesting because they're talking here about the dissonance between a premier in Alberta stepping away from the carbon tax in 2019 during wildfires, which were choking Edmonton. And so I think there's an interesting resonance with this in our current moment. But also, I think you can see or feel the dissonance in this magazine cover between the mobilization of an apocalyptic, fear-based narrative, and an attempt to use that to gather attention to translate perhaps maybe into a more adaptive or progressive, helpful response. And I think we need to rethink that approach where you start out trying to scare people with the idea of leaving them with a message of hope. And I think maybe that's something we can talk a little bit more about, why the fires in particular as an extreme event were so important to the conversation, and the minor shifts I think we're seeing, and what the idea of loss might mean for the ways in which we try to work with people and mobilize a response to climate change. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'm excited to hear what people have been saying in the chat and what we're all going to talk about.
Great, thank you, Chris. And I think we're gonna get all of the panelists back in the room on video. I just want to make a few concluding remarks. First of all, thank you everyone for the really informative presentations. I certainly learned a lot from that. A lot of positives in terms of, some of the coverage going well, increasing, but as we've also heard, a lot of challenges that we need to overcome as well. So that's really what we want to dig into with the next bit of time that we have. And just as a reminder, we're scheduled to go through until 1:15. So, I think one of the big takeaways is, as Chris was saying, these are big moments, and we really need to learn how best to leverage them to advance conversations about that pathway. And that really stood out for me, just the lack of connection between the source of the problem, the extreme events, the impacts, and then what do we actually do about this? And so I think, connecting those dots is really critical for people. And when you are pitching media, to be connecting those dots. But when we have those extreme weather events, really approaching it first from a place of empathy, recognizing the difficult situation people are facing, and then pivoting to both the short-term and long-term actions. I think there's also a time in the arc of an extreme weather event and the way it's being reported, that it's not necessarily the appropriate time to come out right away and hammer on climate change. But when the worst of the impacts are subsiding, that is when the reporting tends to move into the recovery. And that's when we can really start to talk about the need to do things differently. I think also just making sure that we are connecting the dots, the source of the problem, but being really clear that the big source of the problem for Canada is oil and gas. And you could understand how it is very confusing for Canadians when in some ways we are taking quite bold climate action, and on the other hand, we want to still expand our oil and gas. So I think calling it what it is, that those really are the main drivers of climate pollution in Canada. And we're not going to get to dealing with the problem by deceiving ourselves or deflecting with false solutions like carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, that we actually need to get off of oil and gas and get into other areas. And that the pathway for people, we got to make it also simple. And I think this goes to, what are some of the big steps we need to take, like electrifying, so we can get fossil fuels out of our homes, out of our communities, out of our transit. And that gets into issues of affordability that we want to address as well. And I want to just mention, and I'm hoping one of my colleagues can put the link in the chat, but our colleague here at Re.Climate, Louise Comeau, with Trevor Melanson, produced a messaging energy affordability guide, which is really helpful as a way to really, how do you dig into those concerns and issues about affordability. But I think we also want to look at climate action as a way to deliver affordability. For example, on heat pumps, not only can you increase comfort in your home, but it's a great way to save money if you're on oil or gas heat. Part of this is about the jobs. What is it, on this pathway, what is it that we will be doing in terms of creating new opportunities? And I think one of the things that we need to be careful of is not talking about the transition, this pathway we need to get on, as simply moving from dirty fossil-based energy to renewable energy. There's a lot of different opportunities and ways for us to create new jobs, new economic opportunities with retrofitting, with all of what we need to do to adapt to climate change. Just one other point around the extreme weather events. So I mentioned earlier, we want to connect the dots between the impacts, the source, the solutions. But we really want to make sure that when we are starting with the extreme weather event, we're not stopping with what we need to do to prepare and reduce the risk of that. And those are terms that we recommend rather than adapt. But we have to get to the root of the problem. And that means dealing with carbon, dealing with climate pollution, and again, calling it what it is with oil and gas. And we found for years in doing work around adaptation communications, around extreme weather events, you actually really can move people. That people, as Chris would say, are sort of catching on to the fact these things are happening and they're connected. And so you can move people into what are the steps we need to do to cut the risk at the root. So those are some just reflections and recommendations as part of what we're aiming to do at Re.Climate, is really do great analysis, but also what does this mean for communicators and the practice of communications, and how we advance this. So thanks everyone for the questions that you've been putting in the Q&A. We'll go to some of those now. There was one that was just sort of an issue about the methodology, and Gada, this one is for you. So when you were categorizing the different narratives, did you find that in some stories there was a mix? And so how did you determine if there was a mix, which category it would fall into?
Yeah, thank you, Kara. So what we did is that we had two ways of doing this. The result that we're showing were the result of the codes for each story. So one way is just to classify or to code the story according to a primary frame. And then the other way is that if there's more than one, and this happens with some of the stories, then we calculate also the code. So a story could have, for example, adaptation and at the same time impacts. And so these are two frames that can happen simultaneously. So we calculated both and we had them and we shared, but also we had another category just for the primary frame. And we were checking if the results are somehow close, or we have different results, and we ended up with consistent results for the primary frame with the total codes for each story. So the short answer is that we did it both way, but we also, there was the stories where it had more than one code, and we had to consider these 2 or 3 codes when calculating the results.
Okay, great. And let's dig in also just a related question regarding Danielle Smith showing up, and maybe Gada, followed by either Chris who wants to take this, but just a question about a little bit more about explaining what her narrative was and if she is connecting wildfires to climate change and feeding into the misinformation. So Gada, I'll start with you, but then the other Chris's, feel free to jump in.
Well, for Danielle Smith, I mean, when we say there are voices that appear, it doesn't mean that, necessarily that there's this positive coverage that they are, saluted or seen. I wouldn't say that this is what is happening in media. So when Danielle Smith is brought up, sometimes either in a neutral way, of like a way of reporting that, for example, the story about arson and Daniel Smith appeared in these stories, or some stories where she had a press conference, and then she was asked about climate change and wildfires. But I would just suggest that it is, and this is something that Chris Russell can elaborate more, is that sometimes when these stories from politicians reported in a neutral way, this is problematic and given the space of for misinformation. And so giving the story, for example, about arson, kind of a bigger impact than when it could happen. But I will stop here, and I wonder if Chris Hatch want to share more, or Chris Russell.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends if the question is what was Danielle Smith's narrative, or how was it covered. Her narrative was very much to connect the fires to human activity, to arson, and she tried really hard to stay away from any connection to climate change. And even, you probably saw quite a few instances where radio hosts or others were pushing her, like, won't you admit that this is at least partly, connected to climate change? And she would just always pivot, never make the explicit connection. So that's her narrative. I think that actually our sense of the media's narrative about Smith was actually quite skeptical, so that she would often be framed in terms of, while certain premiers won't even make the obvious connection, was sort of the undertone. And that's true in the national media on broader climate stuff as well, beyond wildfires, where the coverage of the renewables pause, the freeze on new renewable projects in Alberta, for example, gets pretty pointed, skeptical framing. Like the undertone is, can you believe that this is actually happening in this day and age? So, I mean, that's the two sides of her narrative and how the national press is covering it, I think.
Chris Russell, anything to add?
Not really. I think that covers it pretty well. The only thing I would add more generally about Smith's role in the kind of larger conversation is that she appears unique in some ways, but I would say not really. It's kind of a continuation of the anti-carbon tax movement that got put together by Brad Wall, Andrew Scheer, Scott Moe. When Doug Ford got elected, he joined. There's a way in which it appears to be a kind of populist argument, but is really elite driven. And I think this is a difficult thing in which we have to sort out how we deal with politicians that adopt this style of communication that sometimes veer into questions of misinformation and conspiracy. Not always, and often the opposition to the carbon tax, I mean, it's a legitimate argument to make, but sometimes the examples that are enrolled are questionable. But I think Smith is a continuation of that history and that kind of legacy and the struggle we've been having, even though she may present some unique differences and difficulties.
Okay, great, thank you. There were quite a few questions about health coming up in the Q&A, also in the questions we received in advance. So I'm going to bundle them together, and I'll start, Chris Hatch, with you in a response. So some surprise, people are expressing that medical professionals aren't really showing up, that the health frame isn't more dominant. So a question about whether or not there was difference in the type of stories, sort of breaking news versus feature stories, and if they tended to show up more in a feature story context, whether or not doctors were included in the percentage of scientists. So that's just, I guess, a bit of a methodology question. And then what can we do to improve coverage of the health effects related to climate change? So Chris Hatch, starting with you.
Yeah, okay. So we broke out doctors and scientists. That's the quick answer to a quick question. What were the other bits? So yeah, feature stories definitely are more likely to include health impacts than breaking news. So that's definitely true. Of course, also get less play. So fewer people are spending time, multiple minutes in a feature story as are sort of hitting the, breaking news headlines. What was the third bit, Kara?
How we can improve coverage of the health impacts of climate change.
Yeah, well, I think one thing on this is that that the national media will be driven by more regional media on this kind of thing. That's one angle. So I think that there's much more opportunity to push local and regional media, radio shows, that kind of thing, to incorporate medical professionals and specifically doctors in coverage, and that sort of has an upward pressure on the national media. It's also that I think the health effects is something that that communicators can highlight in the climate change conversation more broadly, where you have the context to do it. So it's about, the effects of natural gas in the home, from stoves, that kind of thing, the benefits. It goes to the benefits that we get from electrification and the solutions, right? So that getting look how important getting lead out of gasoline was for cars, and the next step now is to really clean up our cities, getting fossil fuels out of cars and trucks, gasoline and diesel out of cars and trucks. And so communicators that aren't medical professionals, I think, can platform the health effects on the positive side as well, much more, because that is still much less covered than the negative health effects of climate change. And it's such an obvious an attractive benefit for the public. We're going to have cleaner air in the cities. We're going to have healthier air in our homes.
Got anything you'd like to add in terms of how do we improve coverage of the health impacts?
Yeah, I think it's also a matter of, if we're speaking about media, is that also it's a matter of an organizational issue, is that, there's wildfire stories. We need the list of people who we go to ask them. And I assume is that the issue is that there's kind of not much channels of communication between health practitioners and media in that sense. So as a journalist, I need doctors that I go to and ask, and doctors or health practitioners those are busy people, and they might be hesitant to engage with media around climate when they feel they are not comfortable or it's not their area. So I think it's a lot of work needs to be done and on training health professionals in approaching media, and be more comfortable in that domain, and also with media of facilitating that network where they could reach to, or that bureau or group of doctors they could speak to around these issues. And Re.Climate, that's what we're trying to do, working on that gap and helping to improve this by working with the Canadian Association of Physicians for environment, and bringing working on that area to bring more awareness about the health impacts, but also is that how to you know, make it a frame that it can appeal more people to engage with climate and climate action.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gada. Tricia, I want to direct a couple of questions to you. When, especially given the work that you do is trauma informed, if we are trying to, really lean into these experiences and that we're having now as a way to motivate people, increase understanding of the issues, how do we do that in a way that doesn't add to despair? So that would be one. And then related to anger, there was one regarding in your work whether or not anger was coming up, and how do we sort of think about that and in our communications work as well.
Thank you for these. The question of not adding to despair is one that really kind of drives this project in many ways. And this project started with Sean Holman based at UVic, sort of looking at like, how can journalists do this work better so that they are not necessarily adding to despair, or also so that maybe there are times within the storytelling frame or the period that you're spending together with a storyteller, kind of going through like, what happened then? How did that feel? What did you see? What did you hear? What were these experiences? So there is kind of like this time that you spend in it, but then it's getting out of it. It's getting out of it to like, so even the question like, how did you help someone else can sort of start to get you kind of a little bit out of it. And there's more questions too, but I think that's part of it, sort of acknowledging that there is a loss here, right? That whatever the experience is that there has been some loss, and taking that really seriously together. And then what can we learn from it, or how can we live together in it, and going forward, how can we survive together, I think is part of it. And then the question of anger is such a good question. And we have so much more work to do. We're spread across these different post-secondary institutions. We're doing this reporting. We're also trying to go to the next level of investigating and, finding, the health impacts of planting trees during a summer of smoky wildfires. What we need to spend more time on too is sort of what are the patterns that we're starting to see. So I can say that we do see anger, like it does come up, but I couldn't give you a quantitative percentage of how many people are angry or how do they express that. We do see that. We see anger. We see concern. We see this sort of, if it's like this now, what will it look like for kids and for grandkids? And I think that maybe there was another question in there too around, does everyone necessarily attribute this to climate change, and or do they then attribute a cause for, what is causing climate change, and then what caused this thing that happened to them? And that's not necessarily the case, which is kind of one of the many interesting things, is that in finding stories together, we also find some space to engage with maybe folks who don't all have the same ideas about everything. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and just maybe a couple more points on the anger piece. The work of Marshall Gans, anger can be a motivating emotion, but you can't leave people hanging there. And so it goes back to the importance of making the solutions and that pathway we need to be on more accessible for folks. Also, just to point out, there was some interesting research done by Yale Climate Communications Center and Potential Energy in a number of different countries, and they found the biggest motivator for climate action was care about one's family, friends, and future generations. So love, and how do we bring more love and compassion and care into our communications. So I just wanted to mention a few of those. We had a lot of other questions that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to today, but I do want to thank all of our panelists today for excellent presentations and this discussion. And thanks to everyone for joining us today for this conversation. We are going to be sharing out the report, and the way that will happen is that you'll get a survey. And once you take the survey, then you'll get the report. So that's a way that we'll follow up from this. The recording will also be available. We'll also be producing a blog post with key takeaways. We also welcome you to reach out to us. Our email is info@reclimate.ca. Our website is reclimate.ca. You can sign up for our email, join our LinkedIn community. So love to have you continue to be part of these conversations with us and become a member of Re.Climate's network. So we will be sending out that survey immediately via Zoom. So watch for that and you'll be able to access the report. And thanks to everyone on the Re.Climate team for all of your help. I know Amber Bennett's out there with us today. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and we look forward to the next time we're together again. Thanks all.